Welcome to a Tech in the Arts podcast. It's the podcast of the Arts Management and Technology Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. We connect you to the innovation happening in the field, and today we're doing a Let's Talk episode where we chat about what we're seeing in the news that sparks our curiosity or any other various emotions. My name is Ashley Crawford, and I am the Executive Director and Publisher here at AMT Lab. And I'm joined by our Chief Editor, Hannah Brainard. Today, we're discussing the very unhealthy, highly codependent relationship between advertising and technology. And because it's, 2024, we're going to talk about AI, specifically emerging policies trying to address the current and future impacts of AI in society. So I did say that advertising, maybe it's the advertisers that have developed a troubling codependent relationship with our data. Hannah, can you tell us a little bit more about what we've been hearing in the news? Because I had to chuckle when I heard of Google's sudden shift that they're not actually going to kill cookies. I chuckled because I would always thought, well, how are you going to make money with the cookies? So what's going on over there?
Yeah, sudden but not very surprising in this case. Just to give a little bit of background for any listeners who might not be super familiar with what cookies are or why they're so important for advertising. They're small groups of data stored in your browser used to track your behavior online. So, first party cookies are those that are generally more useful for functionality within a website, but the third party cookies are really the ones that we're talking about here, the ones that track your behavior across websites. And these are so valuable because they can form this really comprehensive report about your individual behavior online. And that's so useful in targeting you for advertising, but also could have any number of nefarious uses, quite frankly. So, yeah, obviously, there are reasons that consumers would be concerned about the types of data that's being collected and what it's being used for. And so, back in January of 2020, I believe, was the first time that Google said that they were going to eliminate cookies to protect user data privacy. That deadline, they said at that time, I think it would be within 2 years that it would be over. And that timeline's shifted at least 3 times, most recently in April, saying it would be done by the end of January 2025. And again, for context, they're some of the latest to this game. Safari and Firefox all have made major changes to shift away from cookies. But again, it's one of their biggest, likely the biggest income stream. So it's hard to part from. So, January of this year, they started to roll out an alternative for 1% of Google Chrome users that's topics. So it's focused on lumping user information into these little boxes that could help advertisers target them for a certain purpose. There were a lot of skeptics about how useful this would be and how it would impact the bottom line.
That'd be me. I'm the skeptic. But I'm the skeptic on not the I want to advertise, but the how they going to do that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, unsurprisingly, that was not successful. And in July, they announced that they were no longer going to be eliminating cookies. Interestingly, though, also tied to antitrust, that this new method kind of made advertisers more reliant on Google versus other options. So, yeah, interesting, not surprising.
And it will be interesting to see where the antitrust cases end up placing the fate of the cookie. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think now they're shifting more toward transparency, so emphasizing how users can turn off cookies on their own rather than doing it at a macro level. So interesting to see where that goes. And really, it's all centered around like our data and how it's being used. And that's just one case of it. I've heard some rumors about another case. Brett, would you want to tell us a little more about that?
Oh, I would love to. So, we definitely joke a lot in the classes that I teach about how we're being tracked and followed by our data, etc. But I often will actually talk at my phone and speak to somebody as though they're listening because I'm aware that our microphones are being given over to companies when we click those lovely permission and privacy rights as we're accepting an app. So yes, a Newsweek article was shared out that there was a leaked pitch deck from this company called CMG Local Solutions, and it's a subsidiary of Cox Media Group. And it essentially framed a practice that it has active listening. And it's essentially a way to combine your voice data with that online behavior data that you were just talking about to give you hyper targeted advertising. And I want to say that this is leaked data, but it's nothing new for those of us who sort of paid attention to the fact that you might mention something like, I'm really, really hungry for chocolate, and suddenly everything on your sidebar for Facebook or other advertising feeds are suddenly, chocolates appearing everywhere. So anyway, the deck itself that was obtained by 404 Media says advertisers compare this voice data with behavior data to target in-market consumers, end quote. It goes on to say that the technology can take ready-to-buy customers, essentially, and basically take what your spoken intentions are and deliver it to a company like Google or Amazon so they can really lift what you're wanting into your feeds, right? Meta, Amazon, and Google are all supposedly, according to this pitch deck, they're like major partners to this program. What we've heard since then is that Meta is now investigating CMG's activities. Amazon claims that they don't know them, and Google has said that they've cut them off as a partner, so they're not going to use them anymore. But again, sort of what you said earlier, you could always find safer ways of doing things, right? So don't use your phone and talk into the microphone. Be sure to read your app's permission slips. Go into your settings for your phone. You can actually turn off the microphone or do it just while you're using the app. And remember to close your app. I have friends that I go through and I'll swipe close on my phone, and they're like, "Why do you do that? You have all that memory." I'm like, "Well, because." It's actively doing things in the background, and it will affect my battery, but it also might affect other things. I don't know how, everybody has different, what I would call like phone safety, or I don't know what your practices are. What are some of the things you do?
I am feeling more and more that I'm not cautious enough. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to start closing apps unless there's something I really want for Christmas this year.
Oh, there you go.
Talking about it.
Start talking about discounts. That's the key.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the discounts you want on that item.
Right.
Yeah, and I have heard some of the people who are more in the Gen Z zone feeling very comfortable with all this, that they're fine with people listening in on their conversation. They know that that's happening and that they're fine because they can discern everything that's sort of popping up in their feed, and they'll be able to figure it all out. I probably have been teaching marketing far too long, and I'm so aware of the psychology of our brains and how the subliminal messaging can impact us.
Right.
Right. And so I'll be curious where all this rolls out, because I think the antitrust issues are very easy to track.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these other opportunities or infringements on our privacy are a little bit harder. So we'll see what actually happens.
Harder and harder to distinguish, too. So,
yeah, no, I mean, have you heard I think one of the things that was interesting, you said you hadn't even heard that much about this whole active listening scandal.
right.
Is that true?
I mean, honestly, what you said at the beginning, just that it's sort of this rumor that it's listening, and you kind of see it. You're like, I talked about this and now it's on my phone, but that can't be real. There has to be policy in place to protect us from something like that. That's absurd, which is, not really true.
It, um, Sadly, there is not a lot, at least in the United States. I think there's much more rigorous policy in other countries, and definitely in California. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that
Yeah.
later. But it does really relate back to this, any sort of or lack of rigorous policy addressing our rights, and then really any emerging AI. And I say emerging, and I'm going to say the word like artificial intelligence, knowing that it's not emerging. We've had it for a while,
Right.
but it is something that I think we're woefully behind on. However, the good news is it does seem to be there is some movement, globally at least. The U.S. Signed a treaty with several other UK policymakers and countries to essentially set up what's called, quote, the Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence, right, end quote. And that framework is set up as a treaty. And so you think about treaties and you often think about wars, which is a language I would say our listeners and myself, I keep in the back, that we're using language of war while we're talking about a technology, which I find very interesting. But essentially, they are really doing the framework for a preventative to a type of war action, because it's about human rights. It's about maintaining democracy in a world where AI could have some impact, and maintaining sort of the rule of law. What is appropriate in a digital space would be perhaps interpreted as appropriate in a real life space. All right. And so it's really focusing on ensuring that the activities within the life cycle of artificial intelligence systems are consistent with all those values, that their human rights are being maintained, that democracy is not being threatened, and that that rule of law is being conducted appropriately while technology is being developed, which we know there have been problems with. There are also lawsuits around other companies than Google, we'll put it that way, around how they've collected their data for training for their AI. Some of the training camps that are used for visual training for AI, things like that. So, one of the questions that I've often been asked when I've mentioned this in company has been, well, what are they going to do? It's like, well, there's no like really like a way to actually like enforce it, but it's a treaty. And so they're trying to really come up with some procedural models for how countries can work with each other at sort of big picture level AI. So it's less about necessarily how you and I are playing with it. It's really about how sort of the global players are engaging with artificial intelligence, and how the companies and partners with these countries are engaging and using and developing artificial intelligence, and then deploying it for the use of us, that we're going to use or other companies will use. So it's a good start. There are a lot of people that did not sign the treaty, but they're very welcome to sign it. It's very much sort of a United Kingdom, EU, US, I would call it the standard World War II bunch,
Right.
without a lot of the Asian, South American, Middle Eastern, African representatives in the mix yet. But hopefully they will join, and hopefully they'll become more of a global picture on this. Have you heard any scuttle about it in your field, in your areas?
That actually makes me think of a recent study from the Copyright Office. So, sort of going from this global lens to more of a domestic lens of how this can actually take action within our laws and policies in the United States. So, in 2023, the Copyright Office announced that they would be beginning a study investigating the intersections of artificial intelligence and copyright. So many different ways. You talked about sourcing of materials. But this first part that they just released in August is centered around deepfakes and digital replicas. So, talking about like impacts on democracy, we've seen pretty serious headlines over the last year. I mean, not just like Frank Sinatra and artists and things like that, but political leaders, President Joe Biden, for example, that really have a kind of broad, threatening impacts potentially.
Yeah, if you're creating deep fakes of political leaders, this is going to have a threat on democracy, and also can, as a result, end up with individual harms,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So,
I mean, even in headlines of people imitating your loved ones, calling you for scam calls. It's at every scale, some of our biggest political leaders, but people you may know that could be impacted by how simple it is to replicate the human voice or likeness using tools through AI. So, the purpose of the first part of this study was really to provide Congress with some recommendations on potential federal law, and just to highlight a few key points that they brought up at this study. And I would kind of invite everybody to jump into it a little bit more. It's sort of interesting to read what they processed.
and we will have the links of all these lovely pieces of news on our show notes.
Yes.
So thank you for reminding people to check that out.
That's perfect. So, like we said, beyond just celebrities or public figures, this is recommended to be protection for all people. And it goes beyond just the current face, name, likeness protections that exist in many states now. They also suggest that this lasts at least for an individual's lifetime, and in some cases beyond that. And, this is important too, that it's liability not just for the people creating this fake content, but for the platforms that are distributing it. So this also creates incentive for social media companies, etc., to monitor for this and remove it promptly. But also there's like recognition that this could be used, and I think this is kind of interesting through an arts and cultural lens as well, that there might be opportunity to monetize by representing one's likeness using AI in different ways. So being able to have an individual license their likeness if they want. So kind of interesting.
And yeah, and we saw a little bit of that discussion with the negotiations of the SAG-AFTRA contracts. There have been actual contracts that have moved forward with gaming companies and some performers whose likeness is being used for avatars and other gaming profiles. So it's a sign that we may find a future where we actually license our image, but also maybe license our data.
Yeah, I mean, the line I hear over and over again is if you're not paying for it, you're probably paying for it with your data. So
Yeah. And that's, I think there'll be a moment, again, sort of the Black Mirror extension of what could that be. And I do think there will be if we're requiring a company in the future, let's say, to pay an artist who has copywritten a book to let it be scanned to go into an artificial intelligence, what about those of us for whom all the data on Facebook and Instagram was wiped to train AI? Is there a compensation model for that, right? Or is there an opt-in, opt-out model for that it would require some form of free something, compensation in actual cash? It'll be interesting to see where this continues to move.
Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of picture that future. And kind of while we're on this train of policy, zooming in even further from, we've gone global, national to a state level, one of the most impactful states in the conversation around AI is California. So many of our largest artificial intelligence companies are housed there. So a bill that has been making the headlines this month, California SB 1047, recently passed through the state assembly and is now on the desk of Governor Gavin Newsom for approval or veto by the end of September. So it's kind of a landmark bill in a lot of ways. It's one of the most strict that we've seen in the United States around artificial intelligence. In its first iteration, had thorough safety testing, third-party evaluations, reporting to a newly established regulatory agency, and even threat of perjury charges for developers who didn't report safety concerns or lie about it. Which I see you kind of
making faces. Well, and also with maybe a little bit of glee, accountability,
Well, and I think it was interestingly met with a lot of mixed reviews. I think it's this conversation of regulation and ensuring safety without prohibiting innovation in technology. So there was a lot of mixed response, and I think specifically how it would impact small developers or startups, academic settings, and things like that, this kind of heavy regulation. So went through some changes. Unfortunately, in my opinion, removed the regulatory agency and perjury charges in favor of focusing on releasing public statements about safety. It also removed these restrictions for developers with budgets under $10 million, so it wouldn't impact startups, academic spaces, etc. So it's interesting.
It is interesting. I had a couple of things I wanted to sort of tag in and get your thoughts on. One is you can actually, on some of the bigger models that are publicly accessible, look at their change logs, essentially. So you can see everything that OpenAI did from version 3 to get to 4 to get to where we are now, so to speak, right? So they say everything they've done, and including like the massive testing in the most recent one for preventing harms.
Wow.
Right? How can if something's thinking on its own, how can it not do this? But in addition to that, I think what's interesting is I've heard some conversations in the rabbit hole worlds in which I live that there's a recommendation for there actually to be a department level, like the Department of Defense, that there would be a department of like essentially technology, which would move. Right now, technology is sort of split between the FTC, which is managing some elements of and then of course you have the Department of Commerce, which is handling another part of it, and to really say, no, technology is this bigger piece. So that there are a lot of conversations happening, but the good news is you are getting some transparency for those who want to read all of the transactions that have happened for changing an artificial intelligence.
That's really interesting. And I think I know maybe where we're sitting now, there's not the skill set in our legislative bodies as in the tech companies creating these changes. So the idea of having an agency specifically focused on technology would be sort of, I don't know. I'm supportive.
And part of me, I know that we actually have in our federal government a vast team of people who are working on cybersecurity for us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are other technology teams that are doing other examinations. The FBI has an entire tech team, right? So I think we have the skill sets. We just haven't centralized the conversation, which might help.
Yeah.
There are opportunities and costs to centralization.
Yeah.
But I think by doing that, it could create an interesting focus on the bigger concerns.
Yeah.
And not leave it for the president to sign the treaty, but to actually have sort of an officer or somebody who's actually engaged in some of those conversations.
Right. Well, and it'll be interesting to see what happens following this California bill, should it be signed into law, how that will enact or how that will impact other states. Actually, so this is one of 12 bills that, or maybe more than 12, on Gavin Newsom's desk right now regarding AI. So it's
all regarding AI?
Which is, yeah.
Interesting. I wonder why this one got, I wonder, or maybe I'm making assumptions, why this one got the most attention then.
Just from my understanding, I think it was probably the most intense, like with the strictest regulation. Just another one, as an example, was more centered around watermarks. So requiring watermarks on social media platforms, etc., that would be easily enough perceived, read, understood by the average user, so they can identify AI-generated content if they come across it in their feed. And that one actually, was much less divisive, like OpenAI, Microsoft, Adobe, all in support of that bill. So that might also contribute to why it was maybe not as, popular in the headlines.
And probably because we work in the arts, I feel like I'm more knowledgeable about the watermarks, particularly for artists, and sort of discerning what was made by an artist versus what is made by AI. And not that I wasn't paying attention to this, but I think, Rekia, I didn't know that they'd made some of those key changes to it over time. So that's why we have these conversations. Anything that you are hopeful for after you've read these policies and sort of been paying attention to the news?
I don't know. I mean, I think I'm feeling the momentum from the perspective of an individual user on all of these different platforms, that there's more attention to how my data is being used, and I'm getting a little bit more agency in controlling who has access, but slowly.
What would be the number one piece of advice you would give to a friend for protecting their data?
Well, now I'm going to say close all your apps. But I think just in your settings for all of these things, like, know what you're giving permission to, like, read the fine print, because you might be giving away a lot more than you think you are.
Yeah, and they are getting a lot easier to track, like who are they sharing the information with, right? The word partners is that key word that they all say, and we'll share it with partners, but you don't know who those are. I think my main piece of advice is to encourage people to use a browser like Firefox, which is an open source tool, but there are many of them out there, as you said. I mean, Safari, Opera, many of them have higher privacy settings that are just sort of baked in. You don't have to do anything. And then, I use the search tool DuckDuckGo, and none of these are underwriting anything that we're doing. So, but it also has a no cookie model. It just sort of shuts everything down. So depends on, again, clearly there's some people who love the fact that they just have things delivered into their advertising stream and it's there when they're ready for it.
That's true. Well, I feel like I've learned a lot from this conversation. This has been very fun.
Same here. It's part of why I love working on the Arts Management and Technology Lab. I feel like it keeps me up to date and informed and ready to tackle whatever the next challenge is going to be. So thanks for joining in the conversation.
So much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Tech in the Arts, the podcast series of the Arts Management and Technology Laboratory. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, be sure to check out our other episodes and share with the arts or technology aficionados in your life. Check out our website at amslab.org, that's amt-lab.org, or you can email us at info@ampslab.org. Follow us on Instagram at Tech in the Arts or Facebook and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. Our season runs from September through May, so feel free to follow us on your preferred podcast app and look out for the series on YouTube coming soon. Thanks for listening.